hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit.
Paper, J.R.R. Tolkien, that's John Ronald Reuel Tolkien to you, didn't have a clue where he was going. And not in his wildest dreams could he have imagined where it would all lead.
Apart from the hundreds of Middle-earth role-play groups across the world, there are 400 websites, there are SMEALs or specialist clubs to join, models to make and films to see. There are courses, societies, fellowships, computer games, board games and toys, all inspired by the work of a man who simply wanted to create a mythology for England.
They are, or were, a little people, about half our height, and smaller than the bearded dwarves. Hobbits have no beards. There's little or no magic about them, except the ordinary, everyday sort which helps them to disappear quietly and quickly when large, stupid folk like you making a noise.
Now, don't tell anybody, but it looks like Tolkien didn't actually invent the word hobbit. A Yorkshire folklorist beat him to it by almost a century. But that's not to say he didn't invent hobbits themselves. He clearly did, and very much in his own image.
I am, in fact, a hobbit, in all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmland. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated. But I detest French cooking. I go to bed late and get up late, when possible. I do not travel much.
It's true that Tolkien didn't often venture very far from home, but it's hard to think of anyone who's taken us on such great journeys and adventures in our imagination. At 10, and probably only because of Ewan McGregor and the movie, it's Irvine Welsh's Train Spotting. Hot on its heels at number 9, John Steinbeck's old-time classic, The Grapes of Wrath. And at number 8, in this 100-year survey of books, we have Gabriel Garcia Marquez with 100 Years of Solitude. And at 7, it's To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. At 6 with a bullet, it's that GCSE O-level favourite, J.J. Salinger's Catcher in the Rye. Joseph Heller's Catch-22 is alive at number 5, not half. And yes, it's the book everyone claims to have read but never has, James Joyce Ulysses at number 4. George Orwell, The Boy Done Good, sneaks in with a double whammy, Animal Farm at number 3, and the prophetic 1984 at number 2. But with many more votes than anyone else by far, at number 1, numero uno, top of the pops of the 20th century is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings came top of polls run by Waterstones and Channel 4, the Daily Telegraph and the Folio Society. And in a specially commissioned Maury poll, it came second only to the Bible. Another good story. So the great British book-buying public had stood up and been counted. But the chattering classes were horrified.
I wasn't surprised that Tolkien was voted the greatest writer of the 20th century because he tells a really good story, and people love stories. But on the other hand, I don't myself think that Lord of the Rings does deserve that place in the literary canon, because whilst it's a good story, it doesn't have the depth of characterization that the greatest novels have. It doesn't have a profound and subtle moral analysis. It deals in absolutes of good and evil, obviously. And you don't get, what I also think is important, a sense of a particular society at one moment in history, as you do, for example, with War and Peace, or George Eliot's Middlemarch, and many other great novels.
I mean, if you look at the history of fiction in this century, and you're talking about who is the author of the century, obviously you're going to point to the great prose writers, you're going to point to Proust, you're going to point to Nabokov, you're going to point to Joyce, you're going to point to Woolf. Tolkien isn't anywhere in that kind of league. I mean, if you look at his prose, it's this kind of absurd prose that verges from one extreme to the other. He goes, on the one hand, from this very childish kind of country dialect, that kind of I don't hold with wearing ironmongery, whether it wears well or no, to this incredibly overblown epic rhetoric. It works within the confines of the book, but each of those extremes is equally absurd, is equally simplistic.
But not everybody shared her views.
If you let people vote, they're going to vote for what you might think of as the wrong people. But you're not allowed to say, oh dear, the wrong government got in. That's what democracy means. I think that they just object to the fact that he's critic-proof. It doesn't actually matter what critics think about Tolkien. It matters what the readers think. They are just throwing rocks at Mount Everest, which doesn't do any harm to Mount Everest and just makes it a little bit bigger.
Hello.
Hello, my biggest fan.
Yeah, actually, yes.
You want a photograph?
Can I get a photograph with you?
Right, okay.
I had this at my interview of college. I was asked why I liked Tolkien, why I liked Terry Pratchett, when surely it wasn't part of the literary canon. And I said, well, you know, I read them because they're fun.
You can just block yourself out from the rest of the world. If you're having a bad day, you can just pick it up and you're fine again. It takes me away from the kids and the family, and so don't talk to mum, I'm reading sort of thing, and then I'm fine.
Some of the literature that's literature is rubbish, and I think that fantasy as a genre is wonderful. And it's, you know, there are some bad fantasy novels, but in every genre there's bad novels.
With someone like Tolkien, it's the sheer scale of it. I mean, I've read almost the whole of the history of Middle-earth. I couldn't quite manage to get through Baron within the poem because it's ridiculously long and unbearable at places. But it's the sheer scale. I mean, that one man can create, recreate an entire history of the world and manage to tie it into, old Anglo-Saxon mythology. It's quite stunning.
Whichever side of this high-voltage fence you find yourself, there's no denying Tolkien was a great storyteller. I first read it when I was 12, which is over 10 years ago now, and I just couldn't put it down.
But what is it about Tolkien's work that captures our imagination and strikes a chord deep inside? What is it that compels us to be drawn into this fantasy world full of dwarves, wizards, elves, orcs, dragons, and of course, hobbits? Tolkien's recurring theme, right against wrong, the light versus the darkness, the power of good over the forces of evil, was central to all his work, something that was at the very heart of his own life. Having survived a bite from a deadly tarantula, the 2-year-old Ronald, with his mother Mabel and younger brother Hilary, left their father and the darkness of a segregated South Africa and endured the long boat journey back to England.
They came to Sarehole, a tiny hamlet on the outskirts of Birmingham, which must have seemed like heaven. And it was here, in Middle England, that Tolkien's fertile imagination began to develop. The local Warwickshire dialect, with its strange-sounding words and phrases, conjured up characters in his mind and stimulated his love of language. Apart from the tragic death of his father back in South Africa, this was an exciting and impressionable time for young Ronald and his brother. A time full of great adventure and hidden danger. Oh, you lot, clear off!
The mysterious dusty figure from the flour mill who frightened him and became the White Ogre.
Hey, clear
The
off!
grumpy farmer who chased him off his land for stealing mushrooms, who was the Black Ogre. A character who remained in his imagination and eventually turned into old Farmer Maggot of Bamfurlong, who frightens Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring.
Some characters are based on real people. Frodo's trusty companion, the redoubtable Sam Gamgee, for example, was based on Samson Gamgee, a local doctor who invented cotton wool-based dressings. Trees meant a lot to Tolkien. When he wasn't drawing them, he loved to talk to them, touch them, or just be with them. So it's not difficult to see where Ents like Treebeard, the 14-foot tree man, and guardian of Fanghorn Forest in Lord of the Rings came from. In and around Sarehole, the Tolkien boys, Ronald and Hilary, led a simple life, perhaps a little too close to poverty for comfort, but certainly rich in language and literature. As for education, they couldn't have had a better teacher than their devoted mother, Mabel, to whom Tolkien was very close. She introduced him to music, painting and drawing, the richness of Latin, and of course, reading. The books he read gave Ronald a strong introduction to storytelling, opening his mind to other worlds full of fantasy and adventure, full of the sounds and shapes of English and Latin words and phrases. But it was Mabel's conversion to Catholicism that was to have a fundamental influence upon the young Tolkien. Shunned by her Protestant family, Mabel and her boys were forced to leave their peaceful rural haven for inner-city Birmingham, where Father Francis Xavier Morgan, here at the Oratory, became a close family friend. The Catholic Church was a guiding light for Ronald throughout his life, helping him through the pessimism that sometimes haunted him. In a letter to his son Michael in 1941 on the vexed subject of love, relationships and marriage, he wrote,
"Out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love on earth, the Blessed Sacrament. There you will find romance, glory, honor, fidelity, and the true way of all your love upon earth."
At the age of 12 years, Tolkien needed all the help he could get when, in 1904, his mother Mabel died from diabetes. This was to strike deep into his young soul.
I think it's interesting that his mother converted to Catholicism and he was later brought up himself by a Catholic minister, because there's a very strong religious theme that runs through The Lord of the Rings. There's a very clear sense of what is good and what is evil, and not complicated by the ambiguities that one sees in modern life. And I think also there's a very strong theme of temptation that runs through both books. Both Frodo and Bilbo are tempted by the power of the ring, tempted by the dark side, as it were, and it's their ability to resist this temptation that is a major theme of the book.
His mother may well have been the inspiration for Galadriel, the elven queen of Lothlorien, the Lady of Light from The Lord of the Rings. After the death of their mother, the Tolkien boys were taken under the wing of Father Francis and the protection of the Catholic Church. But the love and affection that Tolkien felt for his mother and the rural landscape around Sarehole were two lights that could never be put out. Tolkien's scholarship to King Edward's Grammar School here in Birmingham was to draw him closer to his other passion, his love of words and language, whether it be Anglo-Saxon, Middle English, Latin, Greek, or even his own invented languages and alphabets. He needed to share this love of learning with others, perhaps as a way of seeking solace from the loss of his mother. At King Edward's, he formed the Tea Club Barovian Society, which is the first of a series of boys-only clubs dedicated to drinking, tea in this case, and discussing literature. This desire for intellectual male companionship, excluding women, continued throughout his life with the formation of the Chequers at Exeter College here in Oxford, the Viking Club at Leeds, the Coal-Biters at Pembroke, and most famously, the Inklings, who met here at the Eagle and Child in Oxford, with his great friend C.S. Lewis, who wrote the Narnia stories, including The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This inner circle of men, with its unstinting loyalty to each other, enjoying a pint or two, all heartily puffing at their pipes and intellectually bonding, was a kind of fellowship, the kind found in the Fellowship of the Ring.
He could be perceived as being quite anti-feminist in that he had a very strong tendency to constantly be very clubbable in wanting to hang around with groups of men. And for example, at school, he hung around with a society that drank tea and discussed literary works and ideas. And he continued that theme of always wanting to get together with men, groups from which women were excluded. And it's also clear that his experiences in World War I, where he was very moved and affected by the huge courage being shown by very ordinary working class men in the trenches, men he described as people who didn't have a great imagination but huge courage. And this sense of fellowship and companionship, particularly male fellowship, dominates The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, in that it's a group of men who are making these heroic journeys.
As a young man of 16, Tolkien's thoughts weren't exclusively concerned with learning. It wasn't all work and no play. Close to here in Moseley, Father Francis found the boy some lodgings, and Tolkien was to meet the 19-year-old Edith Bratt.
Her hair was raven, her skin clear, her eyes brighter than you have seen them, and she could sing and dance.
Tolkien had found the second real love or light of his life. She too had been orphaned at an early age, and they soon realised they were kindred spirits. But no sooner had Tolkien found the pleasure of female company, someone he could share his life with, when Father Francis stepped in and forced them to separate till Ronald was 21. He thought Edith would be a distraction from his academic ambitions. And he was right. With Edith safely out of reach in Cheltenham, Tolkien took Father Francis' advice and threw himself into his studies. And after failing at the first attempt, he finally got accepted to Oxford, to Exeter College. From the dark urban sprawl of Birmingham, Tolkien was over the moon to arrive finally in a place that was to be his heaven on earth, his other Serhull. This enabled him to combine his passion for language with his deep love of nature. He indulged heavily in both, reveling in the environment and studying Northern European languages and mythology. But his other love, his love for Edith, was never far from his mind. And on the very strike of midnight on his 21st birthday, the 3rd of January 1913, Ronald wrote his letter of proposal to Edith. The reply was no. She was already engaged to somebody else. Devastated, Ronald hot-footed it to Cheltenham and wouldn't take no for an answer. Overcome with true love, she immediately surrendered to his proposal of marriage. But poor old Ronald, just when he thought things might be going his way, there was another obstacle. Edith wasn't a Catholic, and Tolkien despised the Church of England. He called it a
pathetic and shadowy medley of half-remembered traditions and mutilated beliefs.
Telling Edith that
no half-heartedness and no worldly fear must turn us aside from following the light unflinchingly.
He was following deeply held religious convictions given him by his mother. An Anglo-Saxon religious poem he was working on, called Christoph Kinwulf, sums it all up.
Hail Erendel, brightest of angels above the middle earth, sent unto men.
Erendel in Anglo-Saxon actually means a shining light or a ray, and of course it was this endless quest for light over darkness that is the central theme of Lord of the Rings.
3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for the mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie.
Edith soon converted to the Catholic Church, and after the quickest of marriages, Tolkien again found himself forced apart from her. Their love overshadowed by the darkness of war, the war to end all wars, the First World War. Even though Tolkien had landed a job specialising in signalling, dealing with codes, messages, and of course words, he didn't experience the war from the safety of a communications bunker. Amidst the horror going on around him, he found strength in the comradeship of ordinary soldiers. Not his fellow officers, but the good old Sam Gamgees of this world.
I've always been impressed that here we are surviving because of the indomitable courage of quite small people against impossible odds.
It was here in this hobbit-like world of trenches, holes, and little huts beneath the mud that Tolkien found time to write. But it was trench fever that took him back home to England and back to the arms of Edith. With many of his friends dead, Tolkien felt guilty being away from his comrades. But with Edith's help to recuperate by singing and dancing for him, he was able to turn his mind to a world of fantasy, inspired to write the tale of a mortal man, Beren, who falls for an immortal elven maid, Luthien. This was to be at the heart of his great unfinished book, a collection of connected tales, the Silmarillion.
There are very, very few women in Tolkien's life, and the whole feminine world probably would be one that would be quite mysterious to him. And that might explain, to some extent, why women don't crop up that much, and the complexities of romance don't appear that much in his book. And what you get instead is a fantasy, idealized version of love. And maybe some people would say, looking at the work with a modern eye, that is a criticism of it, that in a sense it's adolescent fiction, because he doesn't tackle the themes of sex and romance.
With the horror of war and separation behind them, Ronald and Edith moved to Oxford to begin a new life together, start a family, and his first paid job. Work, more of a busman's holiday, really. Words, words, and even more words. As an assistant lexicographer, he was helping compile the new Oxford English Dictionary. Started in 1880, it was 40 years in the making, with Ronald coming in at the end to help finish off. His passion for writing and reading to his friends made Tolkien soon realise his future was within the comfort of teaching. But with no position on offer here in Oxford, he was forced to move to the polluted and industrialised city of Leeds. Once there, he again used his work as a distraction from the real world beyond the university gate. He worked on a Middle English vocabulary and edited the poem Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, published in 1925, and became a full professor, teaching English. Not bad at 32 years old. But he couldn't wait to get back to Oxford, to be with Edith and their 3 children, with a 4th one on the way, and to his new job, Professor of Anglo-Saxon at Pembroke, and then Professor of English here at Merton for the next 20 years. Away from the real world outside, this was the good life, the brightest light at the end of many dark tunnels. His luck was definitely beginning to turn. Everything was here. His love for teaching Old and Middle English, Old Norse and Icelandic, translating old nursery rhymes and Anglo-Saxon poetry. His love of everything green, safe, away from the creeping urbanisation of an expanding England. And the Inklings with his best friend C.S. Lewis. This was where he could test out his latest writing, his own tales and stories which were now starting to take shape, usually written alone, late at night in his study, while Edith and the children were safely tucked up in bed. He enjoyed good, simple English food and French wine, and there was plenty of that here. Being close to his family, especially at Christmas, seeing the ordinary become the extraordinary through the eyes of his children, led his imagination to writing stories specifically for them. Bedtime stories with characters such as Bill Stickers, the elusive vagabond wanted by the law. And to satisfy his acute sense of right and wrong, Major Road, a white knight who was always there when you needed him. Everything was now set in Tolkien's imagination to write those immortal words. In a hole in the ground, there lived a hobbit. The hobbit, of course, was Bilbo Baggins, about 3 foot tall, smoked a pipe, didn't travel much and had hairy feet. And the rest, you could say, is history. But it wasn't quite that easy. The Hobbit wouldn't have been published in 1937 if it hadn't been for another piece of very good luck. A family friend, Elaine Griffiths, lent the manuscript to somebody who worked at the publishers, George Allen and Unwin. Raina, Stanley Unwin's 10-year-old child, was paid a shilling to read it. He gave it the big thumbs up, and so now you can say the rest is history. The first edition sold out by Christmas, and it's been pretty much the same ever since. But the two worlds, the commercial and the stuffy academic world of Oxford University, didn't really mix.
Well, I think, if you're asking me about the attitude of scholars to Tolkien, we have this two-sided thing, those who approved of it and those who disapproved of it. And those who disapproved of it, I think some of them were genuinely motivated by real concern for Old English. But the thing was that Tolkien did more than most of them for Old English. On the other hand, they were also, some of them, I think, were jealous of Tolkien because he was making the money, I suppose, if you put it down to that extent, and getting the fame.
After the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien had rather hoped to finish his life's work, the Silmarillion, but was told in no uncertain terms that it was unpublishable. Perhaps we should think ourselves lucky, because if the Silmarillion had been published, The Lord of the Rings may never have seen the light of day. Stanley Unwin, his publisher, demanded another book about hobbits. So again, Ronald had to delve deep into his imagination to find another story, much bigger this time, more grown up. Writing The Lord of the Rings was never going to be easy, and the Second World War didn't help, as Tolkien made sure he did his bit for the war effort on the home front. But his good friend and fellow Inkling, C.S. Lewis, made sure he went on to finish it. The New Hobbit, as it was known, took 12 years of painstaking working and reworking before the story of the ring, the monumental clash between good and evil, was ready to be released to the world. Again, it was with Raina Unwin's help that it was eventually published in 1954, and it was definitely worth waiting for.
No fiction I have read in the last 5 years has given me more joy. The book is too original and too opulent for any final judgment on a first reading, but we know at once that it has done things to us. The astonishing thing is that all the characters are boys masquerading as adult heroes. The hobbits, or halflings, are ordinary boys. The fully human heroes have reached the 5th form, but hardly one of them knows anything about women, except hearsay. One of the most remarkable pieces of literature in our or any time, it is comforting in this troubled day to be once more assured that the meek shall inherit the earth.
Tolkien was so amused by the divided criticism that he wrote a little poem.
The Lord of the Rings is one of those things. If you like, you do. If you don't, you boo.
Although it sold very well and was translated into almost every language, Tolkien had to wait another 10 years before he saw his fantasy masterpiece reach its biggest fan club. Again, another piece of luck, or was it divine intervention, when a pirate American paperback version scored, in more ways than one, a big hit with the drugged-up undergraduates across the US of A. Over 100,000 copies were sold, outselling all other books on US campuses, including the elite Ivy League. The 60s psychedelic generation were hooked. The Lord of the Rings had become their Bible, and Tolkien their God. It pushed all the right buttons. Magazines were launched. Children were named after Tolkien characters. Road names changed to Gandalf Way, and even Greenpeace used lines from the book when going into battle.
Tolkien was the least hip sort of person on the planet. I mean, Tweedy, Oxford, Anglo-Saxon professor, and yet he became the core. He became a kind of, the Lord of the Rings was a metaphor for the whole anti-nuclear movement, and he sort of rejected the idea, saying it wasn't about the bomb, but it was about power, and it was as much about the bomb as it was about the ring. I mean, it's like, what do you do with that kind of power? And he said frequently, like, you can only reject that kind of power. You don't have to use it. And he spoke about the nuclear thing. And he says, one of these things, we can't use it. We can't use it. And when I was a student at university in the 60s, a good friend of mine, Bob Hunter, was one of the heads of Greenpeace, and they were going up into the nuclear testing site in Chip Guile in this boat, and they're all reading Lord of the Rings, and they're saying, well, if the hobbits can do it, so can we. They're going off, and in fact, they gave themselves, the boat kept on breaking down as they got closer and closer to the nuclear site, and they referred to themselves as Lords of the Piston Rings because they kept on trying to repair the rings on the boat. But it was very consciously that idea that the Greenpeace was a bunch of little hobbits going off into Mordor to stop, the Dark Lord, and I think it was Nixon at the time. But
he was responsible for the enormous boom in the fantasy genre in the 60s and 70s, which by the time the 80s came was going a bit rancid. There were an awful lot of books written by people who had done not a great deal more research and read Tolkien and recycle it. Of course, one of the downsides was I was able to get started because Tolkien existed, and in fact just about every fantasy writer for adults or children that now existing owes some kind of debt to Tolkien, even if they only took a vow to make certain they never wrote like he did. He's had that much of an influence.
I first came across Tolkien's work in the late 50s when I was at junior school. The headmaster of our school read a copy of The Hobbit to the class, and up to that point I'd really felt that I lived in a black and white world, and suddenly everything was Technicolor. So it just filled my imagination, and we use the phrase life-changing too often, but that really was a life-changing moment for me.
Tolkien was bemused.
Being a cult figure in one's own lifetime, I'm afraid, is not at all pleasant.
But not always amused.
Hello. You don't know me, but man, I need to know. Does the Balrog have wings?
Although the late-night calls from enthusiastic transatlantic fans were annoying, Ronald and Edith now had no financial worries for the rest of their lives. They'd hit the jackpot big time. Sadly, all good stories finally come to an end. Ronald retired from teaching in 1959 and was made an honorary fellow at Exeter College and an emeritus fellow at Merton in 1963. He continued writing, but without his good friend Jack Lewis around, he died in '63, there was never going to be another Hobbit story. Tolkien was heartbroken when Edith died in 1971, and he himself died 2 years later. But I'm sure that Ronald would have to pinch himself if he knew that 50 years on, his epic fantasy would be voted #1 in 3 people's polls and to be the book of the 20th century. People just can't get enough of it. There's now a mega commercial Tolkien empire, with the first part of The Lord of the Rings already a box office hit at a cinema near you.
Their face towards you.
For many people, going to see the film isn't enough. They want more. They want to be the heroes Gandalf or Frodo themselves, reenacting the many battles against orcs, ringwraiths, and the evil of Sauron. For some, the adventure through Middle-earth is made on a tabletop battle game based on Peter Jackson's version of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Oh, yes!
Yes, both of them dead. Very nice for you.
All right.
dead-eyed Legolas, never misses. For me, it's like being the director, telling a story. So you can recreate it yourself. You can decide how the script goes, where the action should be. You decide that. That's what really does it for me.
You got a 3?
I got
2 hits. That's because you're hitting them from behind.
Right, so with Lord of the Rings, you can totally recreate the classic scenes, the attack at Weathertop, the attack in Balin's Tomb, the escape over the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and when you play it, the Balrog can wipe out the Fellowship. The goblins can win in Balin's Tomb, and the cave troll can, unfortunately, perhaps squash a little hobbit. And that's part of the joy, the fact that you have control. You're calling the shots.
To wound.
Okay.
3.
Armour too good.
Yep.
Okay.
This elf will fire down the hill. When you go and see a film, you want to be that character. You want to be... It's great to imagine yourself in those settings and in those scenarios. I think I'll have to bring my...
Do you bring Haldir down into the action?
Elven archers down. Fantasy wargaming, for me, opens up my imagination. I can become a general, collect an army, and outwit my opponent on a tabletop.
Yes. But it's not just Lord of the Rings. For years now, enthusiasts at Games Workshop have been creating games inspired by Tolkien's writings, such as Warhammer or War Master.
There is a competitive element to it. You know, people fly all over the world to take part in tournaments and play against one another all over the world. But the vast majority of people, it's friends. You know, they meet, they get together, they play socially. You know, for the 2 hours that they're playing, they're the deadliest of adversaries. But at the end of it, you know, they'll have a beer and talk about the game.
2 stands and 1 carryover.
Excellent.
Bye-bye now. Oh dear.
I got into wargaming through Lord of the Rings. I read Lord of the Rings when I was 13, and that really set me down the path to tabletop wargaming.
Okay, right, Marauders first.
And when I was very much younger, if you were into anything like this, it was something that you didn't really talk about. None of my friends were into it. Some other friends that I gamed with obviously were. It wasn't really acceptable. You were sort of laughed at a bit at school, where now it's very much acceptable. Everybody plays it, and it's seen as something to be cool.
I have my nasty assassin in the front.
Oh, yeah, of course, go for it.
So I have to see if I run away.
Your general's within 12 inches, so you can use your general's leadership.
Right, so I need a 7.
7 or higher.
Higher.
Or lower.
Yeah, of course. Come on. Yeah, 6. No.
Get another wound.
It's one thing to read a book and to imagine it. It's one thing to watch a movie and to have it realized in 2 dimensions, really, on a big screen. This is 3-dimensional, it's vibrant, it's colorful, and it's right there for you to get your fingers on and to manipulate, and that's really the joy in it, I think.
One of the oldest fantasy tabletop role-play games is Dungeons & Dragons, which has gripped people for well over 30 years now.
See the 2 figures there, there's the young girl, there's the older man. They're both shagging on the post. As your voices resound through the cave, you hear, and it comes from the back of the cave.
Yeah.
What do you do?
Go over to cut them free.
Okay. Right, suddenly, out of the back of the cave, it appears this giant red creature. It's about 20 foot tall, about 50 foot long. Who dares enter my domain?
She knows.
Dungeons & Dragons is a worldwide game. It's played everywhere. I mean, America, Europe, Asia, Australia. It's quite often just played at home in groups of friends. You know, you'll get a dungeon master or a games master, then 5 or 6 people that come round once a week, twice a week, some people. The creature breathes on you, and a gout of flame comes out of its mouth. Everybody make a saving throw.
I've been role-playing for probably about 13 years now. I started off in a very similar way to a lot of my friends with fighting fantasy books where you work through a problem on your own. I also read Tolkien's Hobbit and C.S. Lewis' Narnia books, and I just so wanted to experience that for myself. As a child, I used to go into my wardrobe and bang the back just to see if I could get through it. Once I found out role-playing existed, Dungeons & Dragons was the only way to go, really.
Finally, the heroic paladiness adjusts her hair. What do you do?
Charging into his left leg. Comrades.
Okay, you charge in to attack. Okay, roll to hit.
Yes.
It's still standing. What are you doing?
Dropping the shield leather on the paladin for a start. The game can go on for a couple of hours to many years, and sometimes your character might last for years and it develops, and sometimes it's over in a few hours. You just roll up a new character.
So you take 9, you take another 9 points of damage because of the shield leather on you. Okay, what do you do?
Some people would say it was escapism, but it's not. I don't think it is, really. It's no worse than playing any kind of board game. I mean, you're not escaping life by playing a board game. I don't feel that you're escaping life. You've just got a good imagination and you're putting it to use.
It's got its arms ready like this, its claws extended, and it's breathed on you. Right. Next. Who had the highest initiative?
That'll be me.
What are you doing?
Falling over.
You fall over. Okay. The buzz you get is the feedback from the people that you're running a game for. If you're running a game really well and you're scaring them witless, they're sitting there, they're scared, you get that feeling up your spine that you might die, you don't want your character to go, you've had it for 5 years and suddenly there's this thing, it's going to kill you, and they look worried and they're working their way out of everything. Their faces look like, I don't want to lose this character, so it's a great buzz. The bouncing backwards and forwards and the feedback is fantastic.
But the very latest, the ultimate in computer games, has made sure there is a whole new generation of fantasy game fanatics.
I keep seeing the beans, you know, I don't want. You've got to do it accurately.
Concentrate, Potter, and try again.
With virtual reality just around the corner, how soon will it be before you can become Frodo, Pippin or Sam, fighting marauding armies of grisly orcs and resisting the corrupting power of the ring from the comfort of your own living room?
Stairs.
So, what makes people dress up and play these fantasy games? And why is something like Harry Potter destined to be the book of the 21st century?
Psychologists and psychiatrists are often argued that fantasy is a bad thing. It's an escape from reality, and therefore it's a sign that people are unhappy with their everyday lives and want something to retreat into, a fantasy world that's more interesting and absorbing than the mundane, grim reality of everyday life. However, Freud himself felt that fantasy could play a positive psychological role. He felt that you could use fantasy to master aspects of your life that you're finding difficult to deal with in reality. And there's an interesting parallel here with J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien himself describes himself as someone who didn't like to travel. And yet The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are about epic journeys. So there is a sense in which he could explore his fear of travel and his issue of travel through the world of fantasy. And that may fundamentally be one of the fundamental attractions of fantasy.
Lord of the Rings was a one-off, and although there are a few contenders around today, namely some rotter called Harry trying to steal Frodo's crown, don't forget, Tolkien got there first. Was it his mother Mabel's conversion to the Catholic faith that gave Tolkien the divine inspiration to write The Lord of the Rings? Or were we just blessed with a gifted writer, born in the right place at the right time?
I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogenic to the level of romantic fairy story. The larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloth which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country.